Have you ever watched a total stranger slowly erase your dead mother from your own home while your father did absolutely nothing to stop it? My name is Victoria, and this is exactly how the man who used to be my biggest hero became a complete stranger to me. Growing up, I absolutely idolized my father, Arthur. He was a highly respected chief pilot and an aviation director. He spent his life navigating massive aircraft through the most difficult storms, and to a little girl he was larger than life. But the true heart of our family was my mother, Eleanor. My childhood was incredibly warm and deeply rooted in her unconditional love. She made our house feel like a perfect safe haven every single time my father touched down from a long trip. But all of that beautiful safety completely shattered when I was just 12 years old. My mother tragically passed away from an aggressive illness. When we lost her, the entire foundation of our family violently fractured. My father did not know how to handle the massive grief. So instead of comforting his grieving daughter, he completely buried himself in his demanding aviation career. He was always working, and the silence in our house became suffocating. 2 years later, that heavy silence was broken when my father married a woman named Sylvia. On the outside, Sylvia was incredibly polished and perfectly put together. But on the inside, she was a highly manipulative woman who brought along her own teenage daughter named Chloe. Almost immediately after the wedding, Sylvia began a very subtle but deeply aggressive campaign to completely erase my mother from our household. It started with small things so my father would not notice. The cherished warm furniture my mother loved was suddenly replaced with cold and modern pieces. Then the beautiful framed photographs of my mother smiling on the living room walls were quietly taken down and permanently boxed up in the dark garage. Sylvia constantly claimed that we just needed a fresh start. But the harsh reality was that she was actively making me feel like an unwanted burden in my very own home. The absolute most painful part of this entire nightmare was watching my own father ignore all of it. Arthur was a brilliant aviation director who successfully solved massive logistical problems every single day, but he cowardly avoided any domestic conflicts. He turned a complete blind eye as Sylvia systematically prioritized her own daughter Chloe over me. I literally had to stand quietly in the hallway and watch my father give Chloe the warm hugs and the proud smiles that used to belong entirely to me. He allowed his new wife to completely transform the entire household dynamic until I felt profoundly alienated. I was just a grieving teenager trapped in a cold house full of strangers. The man who used to teach me about the sky and tell me I could fly anywhere let me become entirely invisible right in front of him just to keep the fake peace. And that quiet betrayal was exactly what set the stage for the massive crime that would eventually destroy our family. When I finally turned 18, I realized that staying in that cold house was slowly destroying my soul. So I packed my bags and I left. Refusing to break under their emotional neglect, I put myself through college working incredibly long hours. I poured all of my grief into my studies and eventually became a highly successful software architect. I built a beautiful life from absolutely nothing. And along the way, I met David. David is a brilliant and fiercely protective cybersecurity auditor. He gave me the exact kind of warm and unconditional love that I had completely lost when my mother died. But no matter how successful I became or how much David loved me, there was still a massive hole in my heart. I deeply missed my father. Have you ever loved someone so much that you were willing to completely swallow your own pride just to hear their voice? That is exactly what I did for 3 entirely agonizing years. Over the course of 36 months, I made over 150 phone calls to my father's personal cell phone. I sent dozens of heartfelt text messages, desperately trying to maintain some kind of connection with him. I would text him on holidays just to tell him that I loved him. But I never received a single reply. Every single call went straight to voicemail, and every single text was met with heavy, suffocating silence. When his cell phone did not work, I tried calling the main house line. But every single time the phone rang, Sylvia was always the one waiting to intercept the call. Her voice was always incredibly cold and flat. She would calmly tell me that Arthur was deeply disappointed in me. She explicitly stated that my father wanted absolutely nothing to do with me, and she demanded that I respect his wishes. I was completely broken. I honestly thought that the man who used to carry me on his shoulders had simply decided that I was not worth loving anymore. So eventually my pride took over, and I let the heavy silence win. But let me tell you the most horrifying part of this entire situation. What I did not know during those 3 dark years was that Sylvia was playing a deeply wicked and calculated double game. While she was coldly telling me that my father hated me, she was actively turning around and poisoning his mind. She was simultaneously telling Arthur that I was a selfish and completely ungrateful daughter. She successfully convinced him that I had entirely abandoned the family to live my own wealthy life in the city. Sylvia meticulously manufactured a devastating 3-year estrangement between a grieving father and his biological daughter. She built a massive fortress of lies right under his nose, and she did all of it just to set the stage for her ultimate financial betrayal. Have you ever held onto a tiny shred of hope only to have it completely destroy you in front of hundreds of people? For exactly 3 years, that heavy, crushing silence was my entire reality. I honestly thought I would never hear from my father again. But then, one random Tuesday, I received a generic corporate email. It was an official invitation to the grand retirement gala of my father celebrating his 35 years as a brilliant aviation director. It was not a personal message from him, but just a mass email sent to family and colleagues. Still, my heart immediately skipped a beat. I foolishly hoped that this was his quiet way of reaching out. I thought it was an olive branch. So I decided to be brave and attend the luxurious event. I wanted to bring a piece of my mother with me into that room because she was the one who helped him build his early career. So I wore her vintage emerald necklace around my neck as a quiet tribute to the woman he used to love. When David and I arrived at the grand ballroom, the venue was absolutely breathtaking. There were crystal chandeliers and hundreds of elite corporate guests in expensive suits. But the very first thing I did was look for the seating chart. I scanned the names for the VIP head table. I saw the name of my father. I saw Sylvia. And I saw Chloe. But my name was entirely missing. I was completely erased from the family table. I looked across the massive room and saw Chloe sitting proudly right beside my father, leaning into his arm and playing the role of his perfect child. Every single rational bone in my body told me to turn around and run out the doors. But I swallowed my pride. I needed to look my father in the eyes after 3 long years. So I walked straight across that crowded ballroom floor. I approached the elevated head table, and I gently placed my hand on the back of an empty chair. I looked at the man who used to be my hero, and I simply said the word, "Dad." But the exact moment Arthur looked up and saw my face, his expression hardened with absolute contempt. There was absolutely no warmth and no recognition. I was just staring at a cold stranger wearing the face of my father. He had been entirely poisoned by 3 years of toxic lies from Sylvia. My father pushed his chair back and stood up. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not tell me he missed me. Instead, he reached out, put both of his heavy hands firmly on my shoulders, and he coldly shoved me backward. My heel caught the edge of the platform, and I stumbled backward, falling incredibly hard onto the polished wooden floor, right in front of hundreds of elite guests. I sat on that cold floor, completely paralyzed in shock. Then, with a booming voice that echoed across the dead silent ballroom, my father publicly banished me. He pointed directly at Chloe and aggressively declared that she was his only real daughter now. He told me I had lost the right to be in his family, and he demanded that I leave the gala immediately. The entire luxury ballroom held its breath and watched me shatter into a million pieces. Have you ever been completely stripped of your dignity in front of a massive crowd of people? I was sitting right there on the cold hardwood floor of that luxury ballroom. My hip was throbbing in pain and the hem of my late mother's vintage dress was completely torn. The entire room fell into a suffocating and dead silence. Nobody moved and nobody spoke. I looked up and saw Sylvia standing at the head table. She was looking down at me with a deeply satisfied smirk on her face. She fully expected me to burst into pathetic tears and run out the heavy ballroom doors in absolute shame. She thought she had completely won. But Sylvia made one massive and fatal miscalculation. She severely underestimated the man I married. I was just about to push myself off the floor and run away when I heard a chair scrape against the wood. It was David. My husband did not shout or cause a massive physical scene. He did not let his anger take control. Instead, he drew entirely on his professional background as a brilliant corporate cybersecurity auditor. I watched him stand up from our small table in the back corner. He calmly buttoned his suit jacket with a single precise motion, and he adjusted his cuffs. That was his absolute tell. Whenever David did that, it meant he was about to lay something out in a way that left absolutely no room for argument. David walked directly through the center of the silent ballroom. His demeanor was chillingly composed. He radiated a quiet and terrifying authority that instantly commanded the entire room of elite corporate executives. Sylvia noticed him coming, and a brief crack of alarm flickered behind her expression before she replaced it with a fake smile. She tried to play the gracious hostess and loudly told David that it was time to take me home because I had a long night. But David did not even look at her. He walked right past her polished facade and stopped directly in front of my father. He looked directly into the angry eyes of Arthur. My father told him to leave, but David kept his voice incredibly steady and conversational. He told my father that we would leave right after he answered one very simple yet highly unusual question. David asked Arthur to state exactly when he had last personally reviewed his smartphone security settings and his digital financial portfolios. That question landed in the silent ballroom like a heavy stone in still water. It was so unexpected and so incredibly corporate that it completely derailed the toxic narrative Sylvia had spent years building. My father blinked and his face shifted from absolute anger to pure confusion. He did not understand what his digital security had to do with family drama. Sylvia immediately panicked and tried to step between them, claiming she handled all the paperwork. But David stood his ground. He was actively laying the exact trap that was about to expose their massive 3-year lie and completely destroy her fake empire. Have you ever watched the exact moment a massive lie crumbles into dust? I was standing in that silent ballroom watching my husband David completely take control of the situation. Sylvia was entirely panicking. She aggressively motioned for the hotel staff to call security to throw us out. But before anybody could even take a single step, David calmly reached right inside his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a neatly folded stack of thick paper. It was not a printed email or some fake letter. It was a legally obtained and highly detailed certified phone record directly from my cellular network carrier. David gently placed the extensive logs right on the white linen tablecloth in front of my father. He kept his voice incredibly steady and calm as he explained exactly what those papers were. He told my father to look closely at the rows and rows of dates and timestamps. He showed Arthur over 150 outbound phone calls and dozens of heartfelt text messages. Every single one of them was sent directly to the personal cell phone of my father over the last 36 months. I called him every single Sunday without fail. David looked right into the eyes of my father and told him that his daughter had absolutely never turned her back on the family. My father looked down at the massive pile of paper, and his hands physically started shaking. He mumbled that his phone absolutely never rang, and he never saw a single missed call. That is exactly when David gently but firmly instructed Arthur to take his smartphone out of his pocket right there at the head table. David patiently guided the old pilot through his own device menus. He told Arthur to open his settings and go directly to the blocked contacts list. I watched the old pilot navigate through his phone with clumsy and trembling hands. When the screen finally loaded, the color completely drained from the face of my father. He went entirely pale. Sitting squarely on that blocked list was my exact phone number. Arthur looked up from the glowing screen and stared directly at Sylvia. You could literally see the pure and horrifying clarity wash over his entire face. He finally realized that his biological daughter had never abandoned him. I never walked away. Sylvia had secretly taken his phone and blocked my number 3 long years ago. She had meticulously orchestrated a deeply cruel and highly calculated isolation. She intentionally kept a grieving father entirely separated from his only child just so she could maintain absolute control over his daily life and his decisions. Sylvia tried to open her mouth to make up another fake excuse, but the undeniable proof was glowing right there in the hands of my father. The room was completely silent as the gravity of her emotional abuse finally came to light, but the blocked phone calls were only the very beginning of her massive betrayal. Because David was just about to reveal the exact terrifying reason why she needed me completely out of the picture. Have you ever realized that the people who hurt you the most usually have a very calculated reason for doing it? As I stood there in that dead, silent ballroom watching my father process the horrifying reality of the blocked phone calls, I felt a tiny ounce of pity for him. Arthur honestly believed that the cruel 3-year isolation was just the result of extreme family jealousy. He thought Sylvia simply wanted him all to herself. But my husband David knew the absolute terrifying truth. David knew that the manufactured estrangement was not just about toxic family dynamics. It was actually the perfect foundation for a massive and highly calculated financial crime. While my father was staring at the glowing screen of his smartphone, David reached right back into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and laid down a second set of documents directly onto the pristine white tablecloth. Sylvia immediately lunged forward and tried to block the papers with her hands. She frantically yelled that David was a liar and that he was just trying to ruin the retirement party. But David did not even flinch. He looked directly at Sylvia and calmly reminded her that he was a corporate cybersecurity auditor. His entire career was built on tracking digital footprints and identifying massive financial fraud. David turned his attention back to my father and explicitly informed the silent watching crowd exactly what was inside that envelope. He explained that someone had been systematically dismantling the massive corporate stock options and the primary retirement portfolio of my father. For 35 years, Arthur had worked incredibly long hours to build a multi-million-dollar financial safety net. But David revealed that just 6 months prior, a highly suspicious digital beneficiary amendment had been quietly submitted to the corporate holding firm. David opened the envelope and placed 2 different pieces of paper side by side on the table. He pointed to the very first document. It was the original legal form, from over a decade ago, which explicitly left 50% of the massive estate to me. Then David pointed to the second document. He told my father to look incredibly closely at the newly altered paperwork. That second document had completely wiped my name out of existence. It illegally redirected 100% of the lifetime financial assets of my father directly to his stepdaughter, Chloe. My father physically swayed on his feet as the crushing reality finally hit him. He looked at the bottom of the second page and realized that his own signature had been completely forged. The looping letters were entirely wrong. Sylvia had effectively looted the entire life work of my father right under his nose. She actively blocked my phone calls and convinced my father that I hated him just so I would never be around to notice the massive financial fraud she was committing. She completely stole his empire while pretending to be a loving wife. Have you ever seen someone completely backed into a corner when their entire web of lies is finally exposed? That is exactly what happened to Sylvia in that dead silent ballroom. She realized that my husband David had just completely dismantled her 3-year manipulation. Desperate to save her crumbling facade, Sylvia frantically yelled out to the crowd. She pointed a shaking finger at David and screamed that he was a liar. She desperately tried to convince the room that David had fabricated those documents himself just to ruin the beautiful retirement gala of my father. She honestly thought that if she yelled loud enough, people would simply believe her. But David did not even raise his voice. He calmly dismantled her absolute panic with cold and hard facts. He looked directly at my father and explicitly exposed the ultimate motive behind this massive betrayal. David revealed that Chloe had recently racked up $200,000 in severe debt from a completely failed luxury boutique business. Sylvia needed massive amounts of cash to bail her biological daughter out of absolute financial ruin. Since my father would never willingly hand over his entire life savings to pay off the debt of his stepdaughter, Sylvia simply decided to steal his massive retirement funds instead. My father looked entirely lost. He was staring at the forged documents, trying to understand how she could possibly pull this off right under his nose. But David was not the only person in the room who had undeniable proof. To completely seal the trap, someone else suddenly stood up from a table near the very back of the room. It was Brenda. Brenda was the senior compliance officer for the massive aviation company. She was a highly respected woman who handled every single corporate benefit package, and she believed in absolute paper trails. Sylvia immediately panicked and tried to shut her down, claiming this was just a private family matter. But Brenda firmly stated that forging documents to steal corporate assets was a massive company matter. Brenda officially corroborated the claims of my husband right there in front of the entire company. She announced to the silent ballroom that the highly suspicious beneficiary change had completely bypassed standard security protocols. It was not submitted in person like my father usually did. Instead, Brenda revealed that the digital form was submitted via a private IP address, and that exact digital footprint traced directly back to the personal home laptop of Sylvia. It was undeniable digital forgery. The absolute truth was finally out in the open, and Sylvia had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Have you ever watched a monster finally drop their disguise when they have absolutely nowhere left to hide? The entire luxury ballroom was completely silent after Brenda, the compliance officer, delivered her undeniable proof of the digital forgery. With her massive financial fraud and her cruel psychological manipulation completely dragged into the light, the carefully crafted high society mask of Sylvia finally shattered into pieces. She realized she was entirely cornered and had absolutely no more lies left to tell. She completely dropped her polished and fake wounded wife act. Instead, she erupted into a desperate, raw, and cornered fury. She actually tried to play the ultimate victim right there in front of hundreds of people. She screamed across the silent room that she only forged those corporate documents to protect the future of her own daughter. She claimed that the biological father of Chloe had abandoned them with absolutely nothing, and she refused to let her child face massive financial ruin. She actually tried to convince my father that I was a toxic threat to their peace, and she had to completely erase me just to keep their new family safe. Can you even imagine the absolute delusion it takes to steal a multi-million-dollar retirement fund and then call yourself a protective mother? My father Arthur stood at the head table and stared at the woman he had blindly trusted for years. You could see his expression rapidly shifting from profound shock to absolute and sickening disgust. The massive weight of her 3-year manipulation finally crushed him. He realized with horrifying clarity that his own wife had entirely erased his real biological daughter just so she could steal his massive corporate empire. He repeated her ridiculous words with pure contempt, asking her how she could possibly call them a family after she forged his name and looted his entire life savings. Without a single ounce of hesitation, my father took complete control of the room. He pointed his finger directly toward the heavy ballroom doors. In front of all his respected colleagues and elite corporate executives, he publicly banished Sylvia from the grand gala. He firmly stated that she had turned his 35-year career celebration into a pathetic stage for her massive criminal scheme. He demanded that she leave immediately and explicitly told her they would only speak tomorrow with a lawyer present. Sylvia picked up her expensive designer bag and realized that her entire fake reality was completely destroyed. She was entirely stripped of all her power and her fake high society dignity. 80 elite guests watched in absolute silence as she walked toward the exit. The only sound in the massive room was the slow and measured rhythm of her expensive heels striking the polished hardwood floor. She stopped at the heavy doors and tried to look back at me with pure, unfiltered fury, but I did not even flinch. I stood tall next to my husband because the absolute truth had finally won and the woman who destroyed my family was walking out of our lives forever. Have you ever witnessed the exact moment when absolute karma finally catches up to someone? After Sylvia walked out of those heavy ballroom doors, the legal fallout was incredibly swift and absolutely devastating for her. My father Arthur did not wait around or give her any time to manipulate him again. Within exactly 48 hours of that ruined retirement gala, he filed for an expedited divorce. He immediately contacted his corporate lawyers and completely locked down every single one of his financial accounts. The heavy fog of her toxic manipulation had finally lifted, and he was moving with pure and terrifying precision. Sylvia genuinely thought that because she was legally married to my father, she would automatically walk away with at least half of his massive estate. But she was completely wrong. Because her actions constituted severe and highly documented financial fraud, the state law completely disqualified her from receiving even a single penny of the retirement assets of my father. She was absolutely furious when the corporate lawyers handed down the reality of her situation. She was officially forced to pack her bags and move out of the luxury family estate she had controlled for years. She walked out of that massive, beautiful house with absolutely nothing to her name except her expensive designer clothes and her empty pride. She tried to entirely monopolize an affluent lifestyle but ended up completely broke and eventually had to move into the tiny spare bedroom of her sister. And the massive karmic justice did not just stop with Sylvia. Her biological daughter Chloe was finally forced to face the harsh reality of the real world. For years, Chloe had lived a deeply privileged life built entirely on the generosity of my father. But without the stolen retirement funds to act as a massive safety net, Chloe was left entirely on her own to face her massive business debts. She owed $200,000 from her completely failed luxury boutique, and she had absolutely no way to pay it back. The sheer crushing weight of her financial disaster ultimately pushed her into severe bankruptcy. It is incredibly tragic when you really think about the absolute scale of their ruin. Sylvia was so deeply consumed by her greedy desperation to completely steal everything that she ended up destroying the exact safety she was trying to secure. If she had just been a decent human being, my father would have always made sure they lived comfortably. But her sheer cruelty and her massive financial fraud left both her and her daughter in absolute financial ruin. They were permanently exiled from the high society lifestyle they had so violently tried to control. Have you ever seen someone lose absolutely everything simply because they were too greedy to appreciate what they already had? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, because watching their empire collapse was a very powerful lesson for me to learn. Have you ever wondered what actually happens after the massive dramatic climax of a story? The truth is that real life absolutely never comes with a magical instant fix. For me, the aftermath of that completely ruined corporate gala was just the very beginning of a slow and highly realistic journey toward healing. When the heavy dust finally settled, my father Arthur was left completely alone in the absolute wreckage of his own life. He carried the incredibly heavy guilt of his 3-year blindness and the terrible public humiliation he put me through. But instead of running away from his massive mistakes, he eventually reached out to me. He called my phone begging for just one single chance to make amends. I did not forgive him overnight. We simply started by slowly meeting for coffee at a small, quiet diner near his house. We are taking very small and carefully measured steps to rebuild a relationship that had been severely fractured by years of toxic lies. I look at him now and I see a man who is desperately trying to learn how to be a real father again. If you have stayed with me and listened to my entire journey, I want you to deeply reflect on the absolute core meaning of this story. When I look back at everything that happened, I realize the massive scale of what we survived. I watched a highly manipulative stepmother completely erase the memory of my dead mother from our home. I spent 3 agonizing years dialing a personal phone number that was intentionally blocked to keep me isolated. I was publicly banished and violently shoved to the cold hardwood floor by the man who used to be my biggest hero. But because of the brilliant and calm intervention of my husband David, the massive financial fraud was completely dragged into the light. We took down an empire of lies with nothing but certified phone records and undeniable truth. My story stands as a powerful testament to the absolute necessity of uncovering the truth. I really want this story to teach you that establishing ironclad boundaries against toxic people is absolutely never an act of cruelty. Demanding basic human respect is a deeply necessary form of self-preservation. You have to fully understand that while a sincere apology can absolutely start the healing process, true reconciliation requires massive amounts of time and undeniable proof of change. You must always have the courage to never let anyone make you feel entirely invisible in your own life, even if they are your own family. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this long emotional journey. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family or rebuild your life after a massive betrayal, please drop a comment below and tell me your story. I read every single comment because hearing your experiences makes me feel less alone too. Please remember to hit that like and subscribe button to support the channel, and always remember to stand up for your own undeniable truth.